So, Alex, delighted to have you with us. Yep, forward, back.
Forward, back, got it.
Should work well. You've got the mic here.
I might use the handheld.
Yeah.
Does this one work? Yeah, great. Okay. All right, thanks for the kind intro, and thanks for Neudata for putting on this event. Excited to be here and sort of talk a little bit. First, a little bit about my background. So I spent 7 years at Coatue running data science. I was one of the early hires in Coatue on the data science team and sort of built out that team, sort of ran data acquisition, data engineering, data analysis, and then research. I left in November of 2021 to start something new, but I agree with the assessment. I think Coatue is sort of on the forefront of using alternative data in the investment process at a very scaled sort of way. So in this talk, I sort of want to talk about two things and sort of hint about what I'm thinking about next, where I think sort of our world, our industry, alternative data is going. But the two things I want to accomplish are basically, first, I want to just speak on an external data thesis, just share with you some thoughts on sort of what might form the basis of a future company. And then the second is I want to give some interesting use cases of publicly available data that hopefully give a more practical side to this talk. Maybe some of you who are practicing right now at a hedge fund can use that as a jumping off point. So let's start with the thesis, the Moneyballization of everything. So I watched Moneyball in 2011, and this is probably what turned me on when people ask, how'd you get involved with Coatue? I watched Moneyball. For those who haven't seen it or haven't read the book, you should. It's a book by Michael Lewis, turned into a movie. Essentially, general manager of the Oakland A's, low budget team, no salary cap in baseball, and effectively finds a way, he hires a bunch of quants or data scientists and finds a way to take the Oakland A's to the finals, has the longest winning streak in baseball that still stands today, and he essentially did it using data. So if you haven't seen this, you should. And I think that the parallels in the story arc have played themselves out in many industries, especially sort of the hedge fund industry. The basic thesis I have is that, in the hedge fund industry, right, for those of you who've started as kind of like the sole data scientist at a fund, it's very much akin to what, the general manager of the Oakland A's had to face. You have an existing organization that knows how to do things, that probably has been successful for a long time, not using data. You have organizations, like at the time the New York Yankees, who've never used data and have won more World Series titles than anyone else. And so you sort of have to make a decision in a very limited amount of time, is this data thing going to work? And you're under pressure to sort of generate ROI on your data very quickly. But what we've seen is that this same story from baseball has played out in essentially every industry. Obviously sports, the Oakland A's are not the only team to use analytics anymore. Essentially in baseball, if you're not doing analytics, you're not playing baseball. But beyond sports, in marketing and digital ads, that's been a massive trend, right? So digital programmatic ad buying has revolutionized the way people spend media budgets. Social media, TikTok, right, has used AI to recommend things. It turns out that's an algorithmic problem too. The news is algorithmic. When you sort of read various publications and you see, for instance, recently, 5 female CEOs sort of hit pieces targeting them from a single publication. Why is that? It's because they get clicks for publishing those publications, and they know that. So whether the journalists know it or not, the editors are playing Moneyball. And I just think that we're just at the onset of this. So I think every industry is going to go through this kind of rapid transformation. And I think the one thing that makes hedge funds different is that we've been the single industry, or investment managers different, we've been the single industry where external data has played such a crucial role. There's plenty of companies, Netflix, Facebook, Spotify, that have built awesome data science teams. When you name, think of the best data science team, you probably name Netflix. They literally commission movies based on viewership history. But the obvious question is, they're using their own data. Why isn't Netflix doing what all the funds here are doing, which is buying data on what their own viewers are doing on Hulu and on Disney and on sort of all the other streaming platforms, and maybe what those users are viewing too, or reading too. Now, maybe Netflix is, I don't know, but I think the general thesis is that the sort of rise of the sort of technologies we've developed in the hedge fund world are going to lead to more external data. And so I've touched on this already, but why now? Why is external data such a big deal like now, and why do I think this moneyballization of every industry is going to go exponential? So first, the economy has digitized. So it used to be that if you wanted, say, scanner data, the only place to get it was from the checkout line at a grocery store, right? We know Nielsen IQ and IRI are excellent at this kind of data. But in today's economy, everything's digital. The ERP's digital, the ordering system's digital, the POS system's digital, the inventory management's digital. So suddenly, the number of places you can pick up data from is much higher, right? You can get data from container ships, from the actual containers, or you can get data from the transponders on the ships. And so I just think that there's like a massive scaling as the world has digitized. And this is materially different than it was 6 years ago. And it's going to be even more different with the rise of 5G and the ability to put sort of essentially IoT devices on every economic good. The second thing is data integration and technology costs are much lower than they've ever been. So Snowflake, Databricks, and by the way, no investment advice, might hold shares in any of these companies. AWS, Redshift, GCP, all these things have made the integration of data much easier. It used to be that you had to sort of provision infrastructure, and every marginal data set you acquired sort of had to have a planning process. Today, with a tool like Snowflake, you only pay for what you use, and it's cheap to throw all your data in one big data warehouse, and then you just need to find a join key. So that, today we take that for granted, but 6 years ago, that was not obvious, and that was not how most data science teams, even at well-recognized sort of corporate data science groups, was built. So I think that modern data stack has changed everything. And then the final sort of, I think, tailwind to this rapid rise of external data is what I call first-party data for third-party measurement. Essentially, Apple broke Facebook. And Apple broke Facebook by enforcing privacy measures, and I think that's just one of the many things that's coming. And for those who are not familiar with the programmatic ad buying world, essentially, Apple broke the feedback loop, so Facebook's ability to measure the sort of ROI on a given ad because of their ability to track users is now materially worse. And so if you're a Facebook advertiser or any kind of advertiser, you need to turn to first-party data sources from panels to measure this sort of thing, to see whether you believe whether your advertising is working. And obviously, this whole Apple Facebook deal is a big deal in the advertising world, but it's kind of symbolic of a big trend towards privacy. And so you might think, oh, well, GDPR, CCPA, those kind of things are bad for external data. I actually think they're good. In some ways, GDPR, CCPA draw bright lines in the sand. The only question will be whether in the US we have federal privacy laws, and I hope we do, as opposed to each state carving their own laws. But nonetheless, these bright lines in the sand will make it clear what you can and can't do, and also will mean owners of first-party data will see value accrue to them because they become the measurement of record, and there's no other way to measure. You can't just pull cookies from third-party sites. So I think these three things are why Moneyball is about to go exponential. So with that, I want to jump into something else, kind of switch gears, and instead talk about some case studies that I saw since I left Co2 that I think might be interesting for many of you. And this is really just meant to show how Moneyball is playing out in sort of the public sector among public data. So I won't speak about proprietary data sets. Everything you can see here is free. So first, COVID and the economic recovery. So Opportunity Insights is a website run by Raj Chetty and his team at Harvard. They're essentially the forefront, and I would bet he's going to win the Nobel Prize. He's still a young economist. And he's effectively transformed macroeconomics. And the way he's done that is by adopting fast data. Everyone's used social science and quantitative methods to measure policy decisions. Is handing out stimulus checks a good idea or not? Is the economy recovering or not? That's not new. But what is new is creating a dashboard that synthesizes all this data together. And I don't think you can see well, but he synthesized consumer spending, small business openings, restaurant reservations, kind of synthesized this all together. If you were a hedge fund, you might think about building this kind of a platform. I think this was a fantastic example of what's going on in macroeconomics on the academic side. and could be something very interesting for the public sector. Beyond measuring the recovery, they've also done fantastic work. And the reason it's called Opportunity Insights is they measure income mobility, right? County by county, using everything from math scores to things, college admissions, to things like spending at different stages in life. And I think it's a very sort of novel approach that could have big implications for the public sector. So that's my first Moneyball in academia. Second is Moneyball in politics. So this time we go to Stanford. So it's another academic project, but it's more political. And I won't get into the politics of it, but what the project did, it's really enabled by technology. So this really speaks to my point too. Essentially, a group of researchers at Stanford ran AI over cable news. So if you watch MSNBC, CNN, or Fox, it's a very linear format. You can just run that through an AI engine. It lends itself to character recognition, speech transcription really well. Honestly, this is not groundbreaking AI. This is all available as like an API from AWS. So you can effectively identify words that anchors and interview subjects and correspondents say. You can identify shows. You can identify, obviously, what channel you're on. And you can identify people. So this tool, and it's sort of like a SQL, helps you write SQL tool, and I just gave an example of coverage, tells you how many minutes of coverage linear TV has talked about various topics. So unsurprisingly, you see the spike in Afghanistan in summer of 2021, you see the spike in Ukraine recently, and you see this kind of ever ongoing spike in COVID. But it's really interesting because it finally gives us a quantitative method to see, well, what is the news media telling the world, and what are Americans kind of spending their time watching? You could easily do the same thing, and again, I put in text, but you can also ask, well, how much coverage? How much are they showing this particular political figure versus this other political figure? How many minutes are they getting? And you can break that down by channel to really understand how the American public is processing something. No reason you have to stick in America. You could do the same for Russian TV, European TV, or for ads. And I think there are some data providers that will run these kinds of methods over linear sources of ads to see who's advertising, how are they advertising, and what are the trends. So that's my second Moneyballization, politics. All right, the third, open source intelligence. So the open source intelligence community is something I was not really aware of until very recently. And it turns out it's this whole alternative data community outside of our industry that's probably as sophisticated, and it really focuses on geopolitical risk. And obviously, the crisis in Ukraine is the hottest topic right now. Quickest way to get involved in this community is to go on Twitter, search OSINT, and you'll see a live stream of what's going on in Ukraine and the conflict. It's much faster than traditional news. You can essentially, in some cases, it's pretty morbid. You can watch firefights in real time. As was kind of famous, you could watch Russians and Ukrainian soldiers fighting one another at the nuclear reactor. And what's interesting is some of the correspondents who are either on the ground in Ukraine or doing this completely digitally talk about how they get the data, how they identify where the latest airstrike fell. For those who haven't yet seen it, because it hasn't yet been on the news, Ukraine this morning attacked a Russian warship and destroyed a Russian warship. This kind of stuff is being discovered using digital sources. One interesting digital source is actually the European Space Commission satellite data. This is just an example. It's actually free to anyone, and it takes multiple images over every place on Earth per day. And so a lot of people in the open source intelligence community have been using this to find, document, and post Russian positions, and have been drawing the maps you've seen on where the front lines are based on this imagery. It's publicly available. It's pretty amazing. And it really has kind of redefined how that conflict is being reported on. So I thought that was kind of an interesting use case. A second related use case, and you can see a big theme is media and news, is a project called GDELT. This has been around for a long time, but it's not very well known, and shockingly not well known, despite being extremely well funded by Google. And so effectively what this is it's an ingestion of every piece of news media, especially focused on local news media around the world. So effectively they ingest and then run all types of sentiment metrics on topics, on everything from geopolitical topics to local issues and so on, and you can effectively pull up how, say, the COVID pandemic is being reported in China by the local press versus in Japan versus in Ukraine. And so I found this, as kind of a continuation of open source intelligence to be a very unique project. You can even query it sort of directly without even sort of paying to host all the data. It's all free. So again, this is a pretty amazing data source. So this kind of brings me a little bit full circle. And rather than giving an example from the present, I want to give an example from the past. In 1970s Chile, there was a democratic regime right before the Pinochet regime. And the basic idea of this regime was that they were going to build a centrally planned economy, but not top-down, instead bottom-up. And so without sort of commenting on the politics of that, the basic idea was that Gosplan, the Soviet version, was top-down. And there was no way that the planners and economists at Gosplan could possibly know what was going on in the factory floor in Vladivostok when they're sitting in Moscow. And so the basic idea was to say, OK, well, why don't we put sensors or computers in every factory to report the inputs and the outputs? And keep in mind, this is 1970s Chile. There were 2 computers in the country at the time. So instead, they used telex machines. And they actually did this successfully for their major exports, where in every factory in Chile, they nationalized the factories and they put these machines in. And they built this room as the kind of central control panel. It looks something out of Star Trek, to really understand what was going on in their economy. And so, unfortunately, a lot of this data was destroyed, but this was probably the most granular data ever collected on a national scale. Better than anything the US Census Bureau has been collecting. This was done in the 1970s. Now again, without going into the planning part of it, I think this sort of highlights what might be possible in the future in terms of how we measure our economy. If you think about it, there's no reason we should be waiting for monthly inflation numbers, quarterly GDP numbers. Like, all that data exists in a corporate database, right? You should, in theory, if there was no corporate firewalls, you would know how the US economy was doing in real time. And our government and our businesses could make better economic decisions if they were able to see that. Now, for many reasons, and for many good reasons, they're not able to see everything. But the question is, how can we approximate that and sort of build a modern cybersyn? So again, I think unless you're Google, and I think Google's probably the sole exception, you only see less than 1% of economic activity, right? If you're Netflix, you have a lot of watch data, but you don't see what those people are spending money on. You don't see what else they're watching on other platforms. If you're Wells Fargo, you have a lot of spending data, but you don't see what people are putting in their cart, and you don't see what people are watching. So I think alternative data, and we've called it alternative in the financial services investment management industry, is really more like external data. And I think to go back to the Moneyball analogy, I think we're just in the first inning, and a modern cybersyn is where we could head to make sort of better policy decisions, and then for this crowd, better investment decisions. To recap, I really think the reason this is happening now, this is one of the things that's most important about an investment thesis, is why now? And I think the 3 reasons are essentially the economy is digitized in a meaningful way, and 5G is accelerating that. Technology, like Snowflake, has made it possible to integrate data faster than ever possible before. And then finally, this kind of shift towards privacy means value accrues to first-party data providers. So with that, thank you.